On May 6, 1937, the largest airship humanity had ever built crossed the Atlantic for the last time. It measured 245 meters in length, longer than 3 football fields placed end to end. Its interior structure was an aluminum skeleton shaped like a cigar, formed by 36 transverse rings joined by 25 longitudinal girders. Inside that metal cage, 16 cells of sealed cotton fabric held 200,000 cubic meters of gas. Seen from the ground, the ship looked impossibly large for something that could move. When it passed over a city, people came out into the street to watch it. There was no way not to watch it. But the Hindenburg was not just a machine, it was a statement. That year, the world was moving toward a war most people still did not want to name, and the Nazi regime was using the ship as a tool of propaganda with global reach. The Zeppelin carried on its tail the swastika, painted red and black on a white background. When it flew over American or South American cities, newspapers ran photographs with the swastika visible against the skyline as something perfectly ordinary. The LZ-129 was the pride of a Germany that needed symbols of technical greatness before the world, and it provided them with every Atlantic crossing it completed without incident. Hugo Eckener, the man who had built it, hated this reality with an intensity he could not express in public. He was the successor of Ferdinand von Zeppelin, the inventor of rigid-frame airships, and in 1937 he was 70 years old and the most famous man in Germany after Hitler himself. He had piloted the first transatlantic Zeppelin flight in 1924. He had circumnavigated the globe in the Graf Zeppelin in 1929, completing the journey in 21 days.
He had been received with parades in New York, Tokyo, and Berlin. In 1931, when Time magazine chose its Person of the Year, his was the name on the cover. The builder was also a man who had watched the plans for the LZ-129 pass through his hands and had been forced to sign the order to load the ship with a gas that was not the right one. The Hindenburg was designed to fly on helium. Helium is inert. It does not burn, does not react, produces no risk of combustion under any known physical condition. A helium airship could develop an electrical spark anywhere in its structure, and the only consequence would be the spark. Eckener and his engineers had known this from the earliest drawings of the LZ-129, and helium was the obvious and necessary technical choice for any passenger aircraft of that size. The problem was that helium, in industrial quantities, existed in only one place in the world during the first half of the 20th century: the United States. American reserves were found mainly in deposits in the country's southwest, and the federal government considered them a strategic resource. In 1927, Congress had passed the Helium Conservation Act, restricting exports. As diplomatic tensions with Nazi Germany sharpened through the 1930s, those restrictions grew tighter, not looser. Eckener had traveled to Washington. He had presented technical arguments in meetings with officials from the Department of the Interior and the State Department. He had described the risk of flammable fuel with an engineer's precision and with the authority of a man whose signature guaranteed the safety of everyone who boarded his ships. He had brought technical documentation, letters from his engineers, helium consumption projections by season. In one of those meetings, an official had asked him whether it was possible to make the Hindenburg safe on hydrogen.
The engineer replied that the right protocols could reduce the risk, but could never eliminate it. The official answer was no, regardless. Interior Secretary Harold Ickes was a man with firm opinions about the Nazi regime governing Germany. It was not a question of airship physics. It was a question of to whom he wanted to sell American strategic resources at a moment when Europe was moving toward a confrontation many in Washington already considered inevitable. Ickes said no because he could, and because he had reasons that no technical argument was going to change. Those reasons reflected a view of the regime that Eckener, in private, shared, but could not express in public without risking his own position in Germany. The ship would fly on hydrogen. Eckener built the most rigorous safety protocols he could devise: an absolute ban on smoking in any non-designated area, inspection of footwear before boarding to ensure no one carried soles with metal studs, electrical discharge procedures before any mooring operation. The Zeppelin even had a specially designed smoking lounge with a double-chamber pressure airlock because the wealthy passengers crossing the Atlantic smoked, and denying them that possibility would have been a commercially unsustainable challenge. But the lounge was the only exception to the safety regime, and the exception was as controlled as it was technically possible to make it. Passengers crossing the Atlantic in a Zeppelin for the first time were always surprised by the same thing. It was not the size or the speed, it was the silence. Aircraft of the era were thunderously loud. The Hindenburg cruised at 120 kilometers per hour with a smoothness its travelers consistently described as that of the finest ocean liner, but without the waves. You could set a glass of wine on a dining table and the glass would not move for hours. You could look out through the observation windows, angled downward to offer a view of the ground below, and see the Atlantic 2,000 meters beneath you without feeling the movement of the ship holding you in the air. The cabins were small but functional, with bunks and a wash basin, sufficient for 2.5 days of crossing. The dining room served quality German cuisine with European wines. It was the most luxurious way to travel that money could buy in that period, and those who could afford it described it as something no aircraft could ever reproduce. The ship completed 10 transatlantic crossings in the 1936 season, 10 Atlantic crossings without a single incident. It was operationally flawless. On May 3, 1937, the LZ-129 left the Frankfurt hangar with 97 people on board, 36 passengers and 61 crew.
The voyage had been announced as the first of that year's season, and the passenger list reflected the type of clientele that could afford to cross the Atlantic on the world's most famous airship. Among the passengers were German businessmen traveling to meetings in New York. There were American citizens returning home after visiting Europe. There was a journalist. There was a woman named Margaret Mather who was crossing the Atlantic alone and had kept a diary throughout the voyage. Her diary would be found among the wreckage of the landing field days later, with the pages of the final days of the crossing still legible. Mather survived the fire, and her account would become one of the most detailed records of what it was like to travel on the Hindenburg in its final hours. There was also a man named Joseph Spa, an American vaudeville acrobat who had bought his ticket at the last minute because he had been performing in Europe and wanted to get home to his family as quickly as possible. Spa was carrying on board a German shepherd he had bought for his children. The dog traveled in the cargo hold. During the hours of circling over New York, Spa had gone down several times to visit it, which would later expose him to unfounded rumors about whether those visits had any connection to the origin of the fire. The rumors never had any basis and were never formally incorporated into any investigation. Spa survived. The dog did not. The crossing was uneventful. The weather over the Atlantic was favorable. Captain Max Pruss, a veteran of dozens of transatlantic flights, planned to moor at Lakehurst on May 6th before dark, with plenty of time for the passengers to disembark comfortably. The weather did not cooperate. Over New England and the New Jersey coast, a line of thunderstorms blocked access to Lakehurst. Conditions at the mooring field were poor. Variable winds, intermittent rain, and the kind of electrical activity in the clouds that made any mooring operation with a hydrogen-laden ship inadvisable. Captain Pruss received word from the ground and put the Zeppelin into a holding circle over New York Bay. For hours, the LZ-129 flew low over Manhattan, visible from the skyscrapers, recognizable to anyone who looked up. New Yorkers out on the streets that afternoon watched it pass. Several photographers captured it against the skyline. The images would show the airship over Manhattan with a swastika on its tail on one of the last days anyone would photograph it. At Lakehurst, the Navy's ground crew was waiting. The journalists were waiting. The passengers' families were waiting. And Herbert Morrison, the radio reporter from WLS Chicago, was waiting with his microphone and his recording disc, wondering whether he would have time to record the landing and get back to the station before the broadcast studio closed. From inside the ship, the hours of waiting over New York had passed with the calm that experienced passengers knew to expect. The crew had served dinner. In the reading lounge, some travelers played cards. Several of those crossing the Atlantic for the first time had spent the waiting hours pressed against the observation windows, watching Manhattan from the air. A perspective that at that time was only possible from a Zeppelin or from an airplane, and airplanes did not hold still over a city for hours, letting passengers look. The Hindenburg did. It circled, turned, came back around, an experience that none of those who lived it that afternoon would ever forget, for reasons they could not yet imagine. At 6 in the evening, conditions at Lakehurst began to improve. At 6:30, the field commanders signaled that the situation was acceptable. At 7:15, the ship began its final descent toward the mooring mast. The kitchen staff cleared the last glasses. The engineers adjusted the 4 Daimler-Benz engines for the controlled descent. On board, there was no reason to suspect that the 11th crossing would be any different from the previous 10. At 7:25, the Hindenburg was at roughly 150 meters altitude and approaching the mast. The mooring lines had been dropped from the bow and the ground crew was gathering them in. Captain Pruss ordered water ballast release to adjust the lift. The maneuver was absolutely standard. The Zeppelin began to descend at a controlled rate. Then something changed at the rear of the ship. The accounts of those first seconds are numerous and, on the most important details, do not fully agree.
That is not an anomaly. In any high-speed emergency, observers register different things depending on their angle of view, their distance from the point of origin, and what their brain is capable of processing in real time. But on one point, most of them do agree. The origin was in the tail of the airship, in the outer fabric. Several witnesses describe something that occurred on the surface of the tail before the flame became fully visible. A ripple, a change of color, an area of the covering behaving differently from the rest. One of the ground mechanics who had been working on the mooring lines said afterward that he had seen a flash in the fabric, not an explosion from within. Reporter Morrison, recording in real time, described flames at the rear on the outer hull before he mentioned the collapse of the structure. That sequence, outer covering first, collapse after, was the most technically relevant information in all of the available testimony.
And it was the information the subsequent investigation would find most difficult to incorporate into its conclusions. The rest lasted 34 seconds. The first 10. Fire spread from the tail forward along the upper covering of the Zeppelin. Movie cameras present at the field captured the flame advancing at a speed that several observers would later describe as inconsistent with their mental image of how a gas leak would look when ignited. The flame was not a single explosion. It was a combustion front advancing. The color was bright orange with black smoke visible. The interior structure began to deform under the heat. Seconds 10 through 20. The tail of the Zeppelin began to fall. The gas in the rear cells was burning and the lift at the back of the ship was gone. The bow still pointed upward as the tail dropped.
From the ground, the image was of a 245-meter structure, tilting like a falling tree, its rear end sinking toward the field, while its forward end remained in the air. The ground crew who had been on the mooring lines began running in different directions. Seconds 20 through 30, the tail hit the ground. What remained of the rear structure struck the field, and the combustion zone extended forward with renewed intensity. The hydrogen cells that had not yet given way began to open. The flames reached at this point the intensity and heat that correspond to the mass combustion of the gas. The final 4 seconds. The bow, which had remained elevated throughout the preceding sequence, also fell. What remained of the airship's structure collapsed onto the field in a column of flames and black smoke that rose over Lakehurst and was visible for kilometers. 34 seconds.
Inside the ship, the experience of that interval was completely different depending on each person's position. Werner Franz, the 14-year-old cabin boy, was cleaning in the service area when he felt the heat. An instant later, a water ballast tank above him gave way and drenched him completely. In the decades that followed, Werner Franz would describe that moment as the accident that saved his life. The water protected him from the flames while he found the exit, jumped to the ground, and ran. He had minor burns on his hands and feet. In the weeks that followed, the German press presented him as a young hero who had survived thanks to his composure. Werner Franz was 14 years old and had survived because a water tank broke at the exact right moment. Joseph Spa, the American acrobat, hung from a window of the passenger gondola and waited until the ground was close enough.
The distance he jumped, estimated afterward at between 4 and 5 meters, would have broken the legs of most people. His training as a circus performer led him to roll on impact with the ground and sprint away while the structure burned above him. He survived without broken bones. Captain Pruss was one of the last to leave the control car, helping evacuate other crew members. He suffered severe burns to his face and hands. He survived. Ernst Lehmann, the most senior officer on board, who had piloted reconnaissance zeppelins over London during the First World War, and who had accumulated more flying hours in airships than any other living pilot at that time, also survived. He walked out of the burning structure with what witnesses described as calm. He had burns covering much of his body, but he walked. He told the doctors who reached his side, "I don't understand." He died the following day from his burns. Those were his last recorded words about the fire.
No investigator on the commission was able to interpret them precisely because Lehmann could not elaborate on what he did not understand. Of the 97 on board, 61 survived. 35 passengers and crew members died. One Navy ground worker also lost his life. 36 dead in total. That survival rate, 63%, in the collapse of the largest ship in the history of aviation, had a physical cause that the engineers analyzed in the days that followed with a mixture of relief and horror. Hydrogen, when it burns, rises. The combustion goes upward, not sideways or down. The structure falling onto the field was in flames above the passengers, not beneath them. Those who died were those trapped in areas where the structure collapsed on top of them, or those who were close enough to the origin of the fire that they had no time to move. Those who survived, in many cases, simply ran when the ship touched the ground.
Herbert Morrison finished his recording several minutes after the structure collapsed. He was crying, and his voice showed it. People had died in front of him. The recording he had arrived with the intention of making as a routine landing had documented instead something that no one who was at Lakehurst that afternoon would ever forget. The following day, the recording was broadcast on stations across the country. It was the first time in the history of American radio that an audio file recorded outside the studio was retransmitted nationally as news. Until then, radio covered events from the studio. An announcer read wire dispatches in the professionally controlled voice the medium demanded. Morrison had brought from Lakehurst something different, the sound of the event itself, with the noise of the field in the background and his own voice breaking in real time, without editing, without distance.
Several station managers who heard the recording that night before deciding whether to broadcast it hesitated for exactly that reason. The standard of the era was that news presenters did not cry. The industry broadcast it anyway, and the decision changed what was expected of audio journalism. Morrison's words, at the moment the tail touched the ground, became part of the 20th century's sonic record. Oh, the humanity! The investigation began the next day. The Lakehurst field awoke on May 7th with the remains of the Hindenburg still smoldering on the ground. The aluminum skeleton of the ship, 300 tons of metal that had formed the 245-meter structure, lay warped and blackened on the mooring field. The aluminum had not burned, but the heat had twisted it. Several of the structural arches, which in the intact ship had been perfect rings, appeared bent, flattened, fused at points of greatest temperature. The smell on the field was of burned metal and charred envelope materials. The reporters and photographers who arrived at first light found a scene that none of their previous frames of reference had prepared them to describe. A destroyed airship does not resemble a destroyed airplane. The scale of the wreckage was that of a demolished building spread horizontally across the ground rather than piled vertically. The American government formed a joint investigation commission with representatives from the Zeppelin Company and the German government. Eckener landed at Lakehurst 2 days after the disaster. When he reached the field and saw what remained, an aluminum skeleton burned and twisted on the ground, he did not speak for a period witnesses estimated at several minutes. He then examined the wreckage in silence, walking around the perimeter of what had been the world's largest aircraft.
The commission faced a fundamental problem from its first day. The material evidence most important to determining the cause of the fire had been destroyed in the first 30 seconds of the disaster. The fragments of the covering and the gas cells from the tail section, where all testimony placed the origin of the fire, had burned in the opening moments. What remained on the field was the metal structure, which had not burned, and fragments of materials that had survived in areas distant from the origin. The investigators reviewed hundreds of photographs taken from different angles at the field. They reviewed several films, including those shot by newsreel crews that had happened to arrive at Lakehurst to cover the landing. The analysis of those films was one of the most laborious parts of the investigation. Technicians went through each frame, measuring the speed of the fire's propagation, the angle of the flame, the color visible at each stage of the fire. The frames showed, when analyzed with the scrutiny of the investigation, rather than the eye of a newsreel viewer, something more complex than first impressions had suggested. In the frames corresponding to the first 2 or 3 seconds of the fire, before the structure began to collapse, the flames were localized in a section of the tail covering. The flame was visible, orange in color, with some smoke. In the subsequent frames, as the gas cells began to open, the character of the fire changed. More intense, faster, with columns of flame rising vertically, the behavior corresponding to the mass combustion of hydrogen. The investigators saw that sequence. Some interpreted it as confirmation that the gas had been the fuel from the beginning, with the covering burning as a consequence of the hydrogen ignited from within. Others read it differently. The initial fire in the outer fabric, the hydrogen joining after. The interpretation depended on prior assumptions about which of the two materials was the primary fuel, and those assumptions could not be verified because the evidence that would have resolved the matter no longer existed. The problem with the testimony was its inconsistency on the details that mattered most. Most agreed on the point of origin, the tail section at the rear of the Zeppelin, but they differed on something more specific, whether the flame had started from inside the covering or on the outer fabric. That difference was not trivial. If the fire had started from inside, the gas was the initial fuel. If it had started on the outside, something else had burned first. The American investigators examined that discrepancy and chose the hypothesis most consistent with the technical knowledge available at that moment. Hydrogen was the obvious fuel, the most dangerous, present in the greatest quantity, and the one any expert of the era would have identified as the primary risk.
Static electricity, accumulated during the flight in the stormy conditions of that afternoon, was the most likely ignition source for a gas leak in the tail. The conclusion of the American report? Static electricity, hydrogen, origin in the tail section. The Germans did not fully accept that conclusion. Eckener, in private meetings with the investigators, raised something that troubled him. The electrical discharge protocols the Hindenburg used before mooring would have substantially reduced the risk of static ignition. They did not eliminate it, but they reduced it. If the protocols had been followed correctly, static electricity as the sole ignition factor was an unsatisfying explanation. The German delegation and the American Commission maintained a technical debate in their working sessions that the investigation's records document in notable detail.
The Zeppelin Company engineers noted that the speed of the fire's propagation in the early footage was not consistent with the usual pattern of a hydrogen cell emptying gradually through a leak. A gas leak produces a flammable cloud that, when ignited, creates a fireball that can be intense but dies out when the gas disperses. The May 6th footage showed a combustion front advancing steadily along the covering, more resembling the burning of a solid material than of a gas. The American investigators responded with the temperature and wind speed data from that afternoon. The mixing conditions between hydrogen and the surrounding air at the moment of possible ignition could have produced exactly that pattern. It was a technically plausible response. It did not close the debate. The debate closed anyway because the report had a deadline and the material evidence that would have resolved the discussion no longer existed. Eckener also raised the sabotage hypothesis.
He noted that the speed of the fire's propagation, the way it extended from the tail toward the bow in the first 10 seconds, was more consistent with a concentrated ignition source than with a gradual leak. He had no direct evidence. It was an inference based on his experience with the behavior of gas under leak conditions. The commission investigated the hypothesis. It reviewed the backgrounds of the passengers and crew. It found no evidence of any incendiary device or of any person with motive and opportunity to place one. The hypothesis was documented in the report as a possibility, neither confirmed nor ruled out. None of the investigators systematically examined the outer covering of the Zeppelin. The outer envelope was not untreated fabric. The Zeppelin company engineers had developed a coating mixture to give the ship's surface rigidity and water resistance. The mixture included compounds of aluminum and iron oxide, among other elements. In terms of appearance, it was what gave the Hindenburg its characteristic silver color. In terms of behavior under fire, no investigator on that commission had formulated the question of whether that material could burn independently without hydrogen as an accelerant. That question was not within the available knowledge framework of the era. The engineers knew the covering burned. Everything burned. The question was what burned first, and the logical answer was the gas, because the gas was the fuel, the element designed to be a mass of potential energy suspended inside the structure. The investigation could not resolve whether the outer fabric could have been the origin of the fire before the gas gave way. If an external ignition source, an electrical spark on the surface of the fabric, had first ignited the coating, the fire on the skin of the ship that several witnesses described would have had an alternative explanation to hydrogen as the initial fuel.
That question remained in the appendices of the report. In the testimony pointing to the outer fabric, not the internal explosion, as the first thing witnesses had seen, not in the conclusions. The report closed in July of 1937. Official cause of the disaster? Static electricity, hydrogen, 34 seconds. The document was never revised. The airship industry's response to the disaster was swift. The LZ-130, the Zeppelin that was under advanced construction as the Hindenburg successor, was completed in 1938. It had been designed for helium, like the LZ-129. The Nazi regime resumed negotiations with Washington after the disaster, arguing that the accident demonstrated precisely the need to switch to non-flammable gas. Washington said no, again, with less deliberation than the time before. The LZ-130 flew on hydrogen in test flights for 2 years. It never carried commercial passengers.
The transatlantic market that the Zeppelins had tried to capture surrendered to the passenger aircraft of the era, which were slower and less comfortable, but did not carry 200,000 cubic meters of flammable gas in their holds. In 1940, with Germany at war and aluminum running short for weapons production, the Reich Aviation Ministry ordered the dismantling of all active Zeppelins. The Graf Zeppelin I, the ship that had circumnavigated the world in 1929, was dismantled. The LZ-130 was dismantled. The enormous Frankfurt hangars, built to house the largest aircraft humanity had ever fabricated, were destroyed by Allied bombs in 1944. Hugo Eckener lived until 1954. He spent his final years writing about the Zeppelins, about what they had been and what they might have been had helium been available from the beginning. The Zeppelin company reconverted after the war into a manufacturer of industrial equipment. The engineers who had built the largest aircraft in the sky designed machinery, mechanical components, products that did not fly. The knowledge accumulated in 40 years of rigid-frame airship construction was not passed on to any successor industry because in 1945, no such industry existed. The builder never stopped believing that the era of transatlantic airships did not have to end the way it did. In that, he was probably right. And in that, he was also completely irrelevant, because the future of air transport had already taken a different direction. At Lakehurst, the large aluminum arches that had formed the 245-meter structure were cut into transportable pieces and sent to foundries. The metal was reused. No more than minor fragments of the structure were preserved. Of the largest aircraft humanity had ever built, what remained were photographs, films, and a radio recording made by a man whose voice broke when the tail touched the ground. Herbert Morrison's voice, captured at the exact instant the future of air transport that Eckener had imagined collapsed onto a field in New Jersey, is the sound with which the first half of the 20th century finished learning that some technological bets do not reach their destination. In Germany, the news arrived with a speed the Nazi regime could not fully control. The scale of the disaster made it impossible. The photographs were in every newspaper in the world the following day. What the regime could not formulate in public was the question its own engineers were asking privately. If they had had helium, none of this would have happened. To raise that question meant raising the American decision to deny the gas. And that meant acknowledging that the Reich's foreign policy had contributed to the deaths of German citizens. The question existed anyway, in the Zeppelin Company's offices and in its engineers' notebooks, without an official recipient. 36 people died in 34 seconds. The official record said hydrogen burned first. The witnesses, who had seen flames on the outer fabric of the tail before the structure gave way, had said something different. Their words were in the appendices of the report, not in the conclusions. The Hindenburg burned because it flew on hydrogen. It flew on hydrogen because the United States had the helium and would not sell it. The United States would not sell it for reasons that had nothing to do with the physics of airships. The chain of causes that produced May 6, 1937, did not begin at Lakehurst. It began in a meeting in Washington where an official signed a document saying no, because the man asking for the helium represented a regime that official, with justification, did not want to help. Eckener shared that view of the regime. He could not say so in public.
He crossed the Atlantic 10 times without incident, building the most rigorous safety protocols he could devise. On the 11th crossing, the weather was stormy over New Jersey, and something in the Hindenburg's tail burned. What burned first, no one standing at Lakehurst that afternoon could say with absolute certainty. Those who had seen it best from the ground were in the appendices. The rest lasted 34 seconds and turned the dream of transatlantic airships into black smoke visible from the Manhattan skyline.